Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, good people. This is Chris Coppola, and I am joined today by an esteemed colleague of mine who this is kind of our project. When we get together to do this, I would like to introduce to all you good people at home, Mr. Dylan Holzmer.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be back.
So this is a continuation of the Johnsonless American political system. Not Johnsonless, but basically the scenario where Lyndon Johnson did not win the Democratic primary in 1948, and somehow American politics has been turned completely on its head, or it will be within the next hour.
Yeah.
So, Dylan, do you want to kind of get us caught up to where we are?
Yeah. So basically, and I'm going to keep the most of it super brief because we've already done 2 episodes on this. So if you really want to get the details, go back and listen to those. But basically, the Box 13 scandal in 1948 is discovered during the election, meaning Johnson loses. Coke Stevenson becomes the senator from Texas as opposed to Johnson. Johnson's big things in the 50s are a very watered down Civil Rights Act of 57 that kind of sort of starts to fracture and shift some votes, primarily for African Americans in the South, away from kind of New Deal Democrats, because the Dixiecrats are still very much in power and successfully basically neutered this bill, even compared to our timeline. So they're starting to go towards Republicans a little bit. There is still some version of a 57 Civil Rights Act. NASA ends up in Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, instead of Texas. And one thing that's going to come up in this episode is Johnson does not institute his Senate reforms to kind of revolutionize and modernize the way that the Senate does its committee appointments and seniority and stuff like that. So the Senate in this timeline is much more kind of archaic, stodgy, sort of how it was for most of its timeline, at least for the last 40, 50 years. 1960, Kennedy runs for election against Nixon. Kennedy wins, but with Johnson out of the picture, he picks J. William Fulbright as his vice president. As a result, Fulbright brings a much more focused, not so much Cold Warrior, but anti-Russia specifically, less ideological, more kind of anti-imperial, because this is as the Warsaw Pact is kicking off. Fulbright sees Russia, not communism, as the big, opponent in this war.
There's always kind of this thing of, what do you call the people we're fighting in the Cold War? Fulbright doesn't call them Soviets. He calls them Russians. I think that's the best way to put it.
Exactly. And as a result of this, the big thing that Fulbright was against in our timeline, that he couldn't influence Kennedy as much because he wasn't in the administration, he was still in the Senate, is the Bay of Pigs and Cuba. Fulbright was very against the Bay of Pigs invasion, which Kennedy followed up on Eisenhower's lead in our timeline. In this timeline, because Fulbright is now vice president, has been in all the XCOM and planning meetings with the CIA and the Joint Chiefs and all that, he is constantly telling Kennedy, hey, this is a new, fresh Castro regime. We don't know what's going to happen. Let's hold off on this half-baked invasion plan and see what our other measures like embargoes are going to do before we just try and escalate with a plan we're picking up halfway down the field. So we said the Bay of Pigs doesn't actually happen. And as a result, that leaves one Castro kind of in a slightly less antagonistic towards the United States position. And it also has big effects for both Vienna and the Cuban Missile Crisis, because in Vienna, Kennedy famously meets with Khrushchev. Khrushchev doesn't have the failed Bay of Pigs as a tool to kind of peg Kennedy with confirmation that he's this kind of young, weak, sort of flash in the pan president. He's much more of kind of an unknown figure, even if Khrushchev still comes away with that kind of impression. He doesn't have the homework to back it up of the Bay of Pigs. And as a result, Khrushchev still tries the Cuban Missile Crisis, but with Castro more kind of in the middle, Khrushchev comes across as more of a bully, trying to force the Cubans to put these missiles on their territory, as opposed to Castro kind of working as a joint partner. And so the result is that the Cuban Missile Crisis still kind of happens, but it's much more diffused, and it becomes more of a diplomatic international affair where, Cuba's kind of portrayed as still in the American sphere of influence under the Monroe Doctrine, kind of with the Soviets imperialistically interfering in sort of the Western world order.
The Soviets. Sorry. You know what? We need
the Russians.
We need to adopt the Fulbright Convention, calling them the Russians.
Yeah.
They have military advisors bases in Cuba. The Cuban government doesn't know what's going on there. Yeah. And I think that's what the Russians do, is they sneak the missiles into those bases, and almost a situation where Castro could say, I had no idea that they were doing this.
Yeah. And so basically Castro's kind of takes on more of a sort of man stuck in the middle kind of appearance. And the other thing that Fulbright does is he brings a sort of more internationalist, diplomatic, negotiating foreign policy style. So, in Vienna and the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of these other things vis-a-vis the Russians, he much more makes a point of, even though the U.S. is in the lead, bringing France and the UK and some of the other European powers to the table to make sure that they're included in a true kind of NATO Western Front combined side of the table, opposing the Russians, as opposed to just U.S. democracy versus Soviet communism ideological sort of opposition. The other really big thing that we talked about in the first Kennedy term is Vietnam does not become the kind of thing that it becomes in our timeline. Basically, we decided that, especially with Dien Bien Phu, not Dien Bien Phu, No Dinh Diem, get my Vietnamese names mixed up. Fortunately, we're not going to have to worry about them too much this episode. No Dinh Diem ends up getting overthrown kind of in late 63, but the U.S. government, especially with a Fulbright at the table, makes it clear that we're less focused on trying to support a very unpopular dictator and then try and foster some replacement that we can still manipulate. The new U.S. position is, we just don't like No Dinh Diem. We will take a policy of neutrality. It's kind of like the analogy in the last episode was an attorney's noisy withdrawal in front of the judge from representing a problematic or unethical or illegal client. Basically, he's saying, we just don't want a part of this anymore. We're happy to meet with whoever comes next. We're going to be a neutral party. We just are going to Pontius Pilate wash our hands of No Dinh Diem. And as a result of that, the big policy win that Kennedy and Fulbright win going into the 64 election season is they get a commitment to an election in Vietnam and South Vietnam.
No, both parts, because basically after, if we can confuse even Dylan, this is going to get big. Vienna Accords in 1954, after Dien Bien Phu called for national reunification elections. So 10 years later, after our little experiment, what we're saying is August of 64, we get whoever is in charge of South Vietnam to agree with North Vietnam to do national reunification elections.
Yeah, and that's the big commitment that the Kennedy administration has won going into the 64 election. So that cues us up. Kennedy and Fulbright running for re-election versus who did we say we had on the Republicans?
It was
Goldwater. Okay, yeah. So Goldwater
basically making the argument of, you don't talk to North Vietnam, you bomb them.
Yeah, almost the Curtis LeMay argument of if you find a communist, you bomb a communist, and that is the first, last, only, and final solution. As a result, Kennedy and Fulbright win in 64. The other big thing that we talked about is in November of 1963, as Kennedy's about to kick off his reelection campaign, he still goes to Dallas. But as a result of a brilliant idea from the new incumbent governor of Texas, a certain Lyndon Baines Johnson, he, instead of using a motorcade to drive through downtown Dallas, he uses a helicopter, an aerocade, a helicade, or whatever we're going to call it, where basically they do this big showy flyby of downtown Dallas with the Johnson City Windmill, Marine One, a bunch of other helicopters as a sort of big made-for-TV PR play, with Kennedy landing down at the Dallas Trade Market to give his big speech in Texas to kind of kick off his reelection campaign. So Kennedy is still around for a term number 2. So Kennedy wins in 64. That gets us to the beginning of this episode. Now, the first big thing that we think is really going to kick up is the election in 65 of the new unified Vietnamese government. Now, Chris, I think everybody can kind of guess, but who do we think is going to win said Vietnamese national election?
Basically, the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
The North Vietnamese part. Ho Chi Minh is probably going to be elected as the figurehead of a united Vietnam. I think there's Le Duan, who's another, a North Vietnamese functionary. If you look at it now, there's really interesting stuff about like the internal workings of North Vietnam in terms of who actually holds power. But basically, the United States is going to support an election and is going to work with a neutralist Ho Chi Minh, who, let's remind ourselves, is not 20 years from when he plagiarized the United States Declaration of Independence. Let's just say that.
Yeah, this is going to be probably not a true communist Vietnam, but at least kind of socialist, but mainly a Vietnamese
independent Vietnam.
Yes,
I think that's
exactly. Ho Chi Minh's philosophy on ideology was whatever gets me to a unified, independent Vietnam is what I will go with. And the only reason he went with communism is because he tried capitalism and nobody cared to listen to him. So he said, fine, I'll go to the other team. So Ho Chi Minh probably still going to be some sort of socialist tendencies and maybe a little bit of communism, but by and large, he's not going to be kowtowing to the Soviet Union. As long as he's got his independent Vietnam that's anti-colonialist, he's not really going to care from there. He's just going to kind of run the country and make it, Vietnamese. Now, the big thing that does is we don't obviously have a Vietnam War. Well, that opens up a whole host of foreign policy possibilities with the United States that is not just bogged down in Southeast Asia, because now they have a diplomatic solution to their problem. One of the big first things I think that Chris really kind of threw out there that was really interesting is with the U.S. not so laser focused on Vietnam, but still at least, for this time being in kind of the neighborhood, they can turn their attention to some other opportunities that are opening up, especially with the Russians to some of their recent sort of perceived allies. What's directly north of Vietnam, Chris?
China.
Yes.
And by the way, I think it's really important to think about China. I think what winds up happening is China participated in the Vienna Accords of 54. I think one of the reasons the United States didn't participate actually in those is because we didn't want to sit down with the PRC. I think in the diplomatic negotiations for a neutralized Vietnam, the United States starts rubbing shoulders with Chinese officials. I'm going to say Zhou Enlai is an example of this, and Deng Xiaoping. I think the key here is this, and this was another thing that we had to sit down and get ourselves very clear about. there's a name that you probably associate with China that I didn't mention. Mao. And the reason I didn't mention it, it's actually really interesting now that I'm thinking about it, because I feel like there's a little bit of a parallel career structure between Mao and Nixon, because they both kind of are rising in like the 50s, early 60s. Then something happens. And in our timeline, it's Nixon losing 60, and then the California gubernatorial election, where he's kind of out of power and he's a nobody. I think I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier about the Vietnamese leadership. The one thing that especially that communist governments were very good about is not airing their laundry in public. And you had this entire like career structure of what were called Kremlinologists. They were people studying the Russian leadership, trying to figure out who's actually like the next.
Yeah, who's actually in charge, or who's going to be the next one in charge.
And because it was so opaque, and this was something the United States had no idea happened, but in the basically kind of crash course in Chinese history, after the Civil War in 49, the Korean War ends in 53. And between 53 and like, let's call it 63, you had the beginning of the 5-year plans. This is kind of when you see China trying to like make steel out of cooking pots and that kind of stuff. Nationalize their agriculture and their industry. And it is a complete and utter failure. And Mao gets blamed for it. So in the period we're talking about, mid-60s, Mao is nobody. In our timeline, he kind of uses his prestige and position as the OG Chinese communist, I guess is the best way to put it, to like rally the young people behind him and use them as a weapon against his internal party enemies, i.e. this is the Cultural Revolution. That's what happens there. But there's a window right here when the United States would be talking to Chinese officials about neutralization of Vietnam, call it 64, 65, 66 time period, where Mao's not at that table.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is this is kind of the one moment before sort of when Nixon does it in the late 60s, early 70s, when this could happen, because 64 is when France kind of begins the sort of European Western world diplomatic recognition of China. Who is Fulbright really interested in cooperating with? The UK and France as the sort of Western Bloc NATO. So as soon as France does it, especially with, the US doing diplomatic negotiations with the new Ho Chi Minh government, that's going to be Fulbright's kind of foot keeping the door open to say, hey, while we're in the neighborhood, let's go talk to China and start doing the same kind of thing. So I think the opening of China, at least diplomatic recognition wise, even if it's the beginning of a long process, is significant in Fulbright's idea of not containing communism, but containing the Russians. But also at the same time, this is all foreign policy stuff. We do have to talk about what the Kennedy administration's plan is on the home front. And in the last episode, we talked about how one of Kennedy's big policy platforms that he at least talks about on the campaign trail is the idea of civil rights, because this is the mid 60s. This is already after the freedom rides have happened. King has been put in Birmingham City Jail. The March on Washington has happened. All of this is Kennedy's first term. So civil rights, while kind of in the first term, he's aware of it, and he had Bobby Kennedy, kind of doing the forced integration of the schools after Brown versus Board. It's not directly in his view, but it is very much beginning to kind of become the cause du jour for the home front in the 1960s. So Kennedy, at the same time as all this is going on, he's going to be focusing on both civil rights and also the space race. Because in the early 1960s, you have this big flurry of activity with, kind of John Glenn, Yuri Gagarin, and sort of Sputnik, so some of the early satellites, Earth orbit stuff. But, the early 60s is when they start talking about, hey, what's past that? So I think the problem that Kennedy's going to have is he's going to want to look at civil rights, but he's going to keep being distracted by things like the space race. The Cold War is still the biggest geopolitical situation since World War II for, the next 2, 3, 4 decades. So even though Kennedy's going to want to try and crack down on and focus on civil rights, he's going to keep having these other distractions. So I think what he's going to kind of end up saying is, hey, Bobby, you're the attorney general. You've been dealing with civil rights. I'm going to kind of leave that to you because I have to focus on this other stuff. Just keep me informed. And he's going to focus on the space race.
So let's address the space race, and then we're going to come back.
Yeah, we'll come back to civil rights. Yeah. Yeah.
Number one, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Who, in terms of a person, are we actually working to contain in Russia right now? One of the things we talked about, it's still going to be Khrushchev, and it's going to be Khrushchev for a while.
Yeah.
Because one of the things in our timeline, one of the reasons that Khrushchev got removed is because of how dangerous and adventurous the Cuban Missile Crisis was viewed.
Yeah.
It was viewed that he took a big gamble, he lost big, and he now can't, I'm going to try not to turn this into the history of Khrushchev. He was a very dynamic figure. He was a very growth and adventurous and new frontier-based figure. He did the space race. He confronted the Americans. He
dismantled Stalin's cult of personality. Like he even in the Russian sense, like he could be seen as, in the communist sphere, their equivalent of kind of a progressive, as opposed to sort of the autocratic, dictatorial, iron-fisted Stalin.
Or that's true, or his successor, Brezhnev.
Yeah.
Basically, if you picture Brezhnev, it's stagnation.
Yeah.
Brezhnev is just, we're going to hold everything the same. We're going to hold everything the same.
Yeah. There's no innovation.
Exactly. And no innovation, no disruption.
Yeah.
None of it. And if you still have Khrushchev, as wild and crazy as he was about stuff, which he was, he also disrupted kind of the stayed and stagnant, I keep saying stagnant, relations with the West. And Dylan, you were talking about a really interesting possibility about a joint space program.
Yeah. So basically in the early 60s, it's kind of the classic definition of the space race. So the US and the Russians are both competing to launch satellites, to get men around the moon, to get men into orbit, to basically be the one who wins the technological space race. Interestingly enough, around the time Kennedy starts contemplating the idea of sending men to the moon, he actually suggests at the UN in, I want to say, late summer of 63, he actually presents it to the Soviet Union as an idea of, hey, let's not oppose each other. Let's try and combine technological forces to get a man on the moon for the benefit of humanity. Khrushchev kind of shoots down this idea, but there's some back and forth behind the scenes.
A show for all mankind about.
It's kind of an alternate history where the Soviets get to the moon first, but yeah, that's kind of the classic line. I've heard it's a good show. I've never managed to get into it yet, but yeah, it's on my list. But basically, Kennedy proposes this idea of combining with the Russians to try and put a man on the moon. And one of the reasons why, if you think of the space race, it's 1961, 62, John Glenn, Yuri Gagarin, Sputnik, orbital stuff, and then nothing until like 67, 68, 69, we get a man on the moon.
69 is it. 69 is the next thing that happens.
Yeah, is because all of the work in the interim is the U.S. and the Russians being like, oh crap, we've done what we can do. Now we have to do a bunch more behind the scenes, technological groundwork to get to the phase moon.
I mean, I think it's a little interesting that we're recording this the day after.
Yeah, with Artemis 2 coming down.
Right.
Yeah. So the idea is in this timeline, and I don't know that it would necessarily go anywhere, but at least I think there would be a more serious push from Kennedy and from Fulbright, especially with a Khrushchev needing to kind of rehabilitate his image after a less dangerous, but still kind of a failure Cuban Missile Crisis. I think there's going to be more of a push for not just a U.S. and a Russian cooperation to try and get a man on the moon, but Fulbright is also going to try and get the European Space Agency, the French, the British, Europe into this and make it kind of a collaborative, almost like a UN space program kind of a deal. And I think whether it's successful or not, that is an interesting concept to think of us pushing towards. And it's also going to be, if it shows any signs of getting off the ground, I think that's where most of Kennedy's attention is going to resultantly both naturally and be kind of forced to go. Because one, there's all the diplomacy. Two, that's a lot of money and a lot of technical know-how that has to be organized, coordinated, monitored, conducted, not just for the United States, but for everybody. So that's a big brain sink. And as a result,
it's also a shiny object, which would distract Kennedy very easily.
Well, unfortunately, nobody's ever put a space missile in a skirt, but I'm sure they'd put a pin-up picture of Marilyn Monroe on the side.
I do think the nose art on the Apollo missions might be very different in this world.
Now, hold on. Here's an idea, Chris. I'm gonna throw this to you live. An idea for the episode art. Yeah. It's going to be Marilyn Monroe in the 7-year itch over the air vent grate, but instead of the air vent grate, it's an upside down rocket. So the rocket thrust is blowing her skirt instead of
This is a family podcast. So no, but I'm going to work on something.
That's how Kennedy's going to stay focused. But basically, that I think is going to, like we talked about, Kennedy's going to have his attention focused on that. And as a result, even though he wants to try and get to civil rights, it's going to take a back burner. And he's going to end up leaving it to his attorney general as the man on the scene who has been doing what he could with civil rights and basically is the one who has, because the attorney general is not going to be in a bunch of diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers. He's the one who's got the bandwidth to try and focus on it. Now, the problem for Bobby Kennedy is when it comes to this, he's the attorney general of the United States. He is not the president. He is not in Congress. He has no legislative authority. He is entirely bound within his abilities as an officer of the executive branch of the United States charged with executing laws which already exist. He has no ability, really, because he's an upstart. Chris, as you said before the podcast, he's never run for dog catcher. So he has no pull with the Senate or the legislative branch.
Where, by the way, because of the no Johnson reforms,
yes,
seniority is everything.
Yeah, so it's going to be the Strom Thurmonds, the Dick Russells, the Dixiecrats, importantly, who are going to be kind of senior figures in the Democratic Senate. They're not going to want to help Bobby scratch his nose. So all Bobby's really going to be able to do is, when it comes to civil rights, is kind of the same things that he's been able to do. He's going to do.
I think the big thing here is soft power.
Yeah.
Is that in our timeline, because Johnson had the relationships with all of the senators, by the way, also with a lot of the governors. One of the things you talked about was calling out the National Guard to some of these things. I looked at you and I said, that's not going to happen because this is some wet behind the ear upstart calling up
George Wallace's National Guard.
Well, he's just to put a fine point on it, he's got to call George Wallace and get George Wallace to agree to call out the National Guard.
The National Guard, yeah. Because they're controlled by the state governors.
Exactly.
Which, in most of the South, the state governors are not going to care a flying fig what Bobby Kennedy, the younger brother of this Massachusetts senator turned president, is trying to tell them.
Right.
And so, other than kind of some meetings with civil rights leaders, like I think you're still going to see the sort of Kennedy-esque sit downs with, Joe Louis. Not Joe Louis is the boxer. I'm thinking the congressman.
John Lewis.
John Lewis. Thank you. Although it would be very entertaining to see Bobby Kennedy go to toe with Joe Louis. John Lewis, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, some of these guys. But that's going to be kind of more the PR side to, as much as I hate to say it, kind of paper over the limits of what Bobby can do with his actual position. And so as a result, over the course of the late 60s, I think you're going to see civil rights leaders, particularly like Dr. King, become kind of disillusioned with not necessarily the Democrats, but at least the current administration's attempts at civil rights. So it's going to become much more of a prevalent thing in the 1968 campaign. And so I think that gets us to sort of what that political situation is going to be. Because you have to remember, at the same time, throughout the course of the 60s, while this civil rights stuff has been going on, especially with Bobby Kennedy kind of being seen as more and more, not necessarily incapable, but unable or handcuffed to do anything. At the same time, the Republicans are going to say, hey, we tried to do a civil rights bill back in the 50s. The Dixiecrats neutered it and basically made it not worth the paper it was written on. We at least want to try some things as an oppositional tactic to the Kennedy Democrat sort of establishment. And at the same time, you have guys like Hubert Humphrey who are going to be coming out and advocating for this position with a much more believable bent because, one, Hubert Humphrey's from Minnesota. Not a whole lot of racist Southern Democrats in Minnesota, although there are a few. I don't want to say that there's none, but Minnesota, generally a more progressive place than, small counties in Mississippi. Yeah. Having been to several small counties in Mississippi, I can personally attest. But Humphrey is also a longtime senator, so the handcuffs that Bobby has in terms of not being able to get real legislative action are going to turn into a powerful advertisement for Humphrey and people like that in terms of, hey, I can do the things that Kennedy can't necessarily because he has no sway in the Senate. So I think that sets up a really interesting lead up to the sort of beginning of campaign season in 1967 and 68. And Chris, we had some ideas, but I've been talking for a little bit, so I want to throw it to you.
I think the one thing I'm going to do very quickly is kind of recap for American listeners and foreign listeners what happened in our election of 68, because Dylan and I loved this episode. Right before I hit record, we were giddy. And I think part of that is how on its head what we're about to suggest is.
Yeah.
Okay. Everything I'm about to say, our timeline. 1968, the United States is actually in Vietnam. February 68, the Tet Offensive. Basically, hey, by the way, let me put this out there. The anti-war and the Americans thinking we're not going to win this actually kind of go back to 66 when J. William Fulbright started holding congressional hearings on it.
Mhm.
However, February 68, tipping point, Johnson, U.S. president, announces, I'm not going to run. He kind of anoints his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, at this point, to run as the state administration person.
Yeah.
A lot of people, a couple of people, Eugene McCarthy runs as an anti-war candidate, but then Bobby Kennedy gets in, runs as the anti-war candidate, gets all of that energy behind him, and looks like he can actually take it to the convention. And at the height of all of this, in June of 68, he's assassinated right after winning the California primary. Going into the convention, you've got a whole bunch of delegates that are promised to vote for somebody who's not alive anymore. And there's a convention fight between the establishment Democrats saying, stay the course in Vietnam. By the way, not saying we should be fighting there, but saying we should be negotiating our way out. And the anti-war Democrats saying we should be waving goodbye. That's the negotiation we need to do on our way out. That's the Democratic side. And the fighting between those groups really gives the Democrats a horrible black eye going into the election, where the Democrats face a resurgent Richard Nixon, who's running as kind of literally the law and order. I'm not going to let kids, because that's what the Republicans see the anti-war protest as, drugged out kids running amok in the streets, running things. Mm-hmm. I am going to restore law and order. That's kind of 68.
Yeah. And so I think the first big tipping point compared to that 68 in our timeline is, with a Kennedy administration, normally you would expect the vice president to run, but I don't think that's really Fulbright's temperament. I don't think he really wants necessarily to do that. I think at this point in his career, he realizes, one, he's good at what he does, but he's I think as a university professor, I think part of it is he's going to see he doesn't necessarily want to be handcuffed by all the things that a president has to do as opposed to what a president gets to do.
I think the other key thing here is you're leaving John JFK's free will out of this.
Yes.
JFK wants Bobby to take over. Period. Yeah. That's what he wants. Whether Fulbright wants it or not, he's going to be pushing Bobby.
But I think it's that explains why Fulbright probably wouldn't necessarily push against as much. It wouldn't cause as much of a consternation. So basically, the long and the short of it is, Kennedy is still going to push Bobby as his successor, but it's not going to have the sort of in-house fighting baggage that you would normally possibly see, because the vice president would expect to become the next front runner. So the administration is going to be pushing Bobby as president in 68. Hubert Humphrey, who in our timeline was the sort of establishment candidate, is instead going to be the outsider, with the angle of Bobby Kennedy can't get civil rights anywhere meaningful. I can. So now you have that head flipped, with Bobby Kennedy being the establishment candidate, Humphreys being the outsider, who has some really interesting momentum that he can get, especially with the whole anti-war, maintain the war question not on the table because there's no Vietnam.
And him running as the outsider, that
exactly.
There's kind of an built-in advantage running as the outsider, because Nixon definitely plays this in 68. Nixon comes in and says, well, I have my secret strategy in the war. You can always say, I have my idea. It's so new, it's never been tried, and therefore it's that much harder for you to tell me it's not going to work.
Exactly. The other thing is, speaking of Nixon, this is, I think, just like in our timeline, when Nixon is going to come out of the political wilderness, but with a much different angle on it. So again, for one, no Vietnam War. And I think Nixon is going to, Nixon's a political animal. He's going to look at the table and see what card, this is a man who won the campaign money to start his congressional campaign in the 40s. by bluffing a lieutenant in the Pacific Islands with a pair of twos at a poker game. That's the Nixon that we're talking about. He is a political animal to the core. He's going to look at the playing field and say, "Hey, remember?"
I think it's important to say this. I think, you know what? Let's create an entire definition here. I think Ho Chi Minh, I think JFK, RFK, and Nixon, all four of those people together. I think the key thing to say is this: they are, to some extent, nihilist.
Yeah.
They believe in power. They believe in taking over, and what gets them there, they could care less.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. At least to some degree, like they have their tendencies, but primarily they're going to take whatever positions they feel they need to get where they want to go. And for this Nixon, he's going to see, okay,
say what you will about the tenets of Marxist Leninism. At least
it's an ethos. Big Lebowski quote showing up in an episode. I gotta love it.
Episode, by the way, title maybe. Because
a pretty long title,
how it's not communism.
At least it's an ethos. So this Nixon in this time frame is going to look around and see, okay, the civil rights movement is the big issue of the day. Obviously he's a Cold Warrior. He doesn't like the Russians. He's going to say communists, not Russians. But at this point, domino theory has kind of, to some extent, been proved to not be as big of a concern as it was made out to be in the 50s. So the discussion, I think, isn't going to be quite as purely Cold War focused. It's going to have more of a home front focus to it. Nixon is going to look at the civil rights issue and say, okay, the Democrats have been ineffective. That goes all the way back to the 1957 Civil Rights Act that Republicans, when I was vice president, tried to get, and those Dixiecrats cut to pieces.
Also, I think it needs to be said again, Brown versus Board happened on my watch as well.
Exactly. In
People
54.
may not know about the Civil Rights Act of 19. They know Brown.
They know Brown versus Board. Yeah. So he's going to paint himself as one of the original advocates for at least a version of civil rights, not necessarily to the extent of like Hubert Humphrey, but he's going to say, I was one of the early guys who, I may not have screamed it loudly from the rooftops, but I have things that I can point to that I was trying to accomplish. And he's going to.
I think that's kind of an important point of who Nixon is. Mm-hmm. I don't scream anything loudly from the rooftops. Yeah. I just deliver.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that Nixon's going to do is he's going to.
I know this is an auditory medium. Please understand. Dylan did just see me do the thumb point.
Yeah.
And I said, I deliver. Yeah.
Yeah. So Nixon is also going to look at, because again, he's a Republican. He's from the kind of Eisenhower small government, not getting your hands into everybody's business. Whereas JFK is still going to have some of that sort of New Deal-esque Roosevelt, big government, even though he says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Still, the country's going to be trying to do a lot for you. And he's going to paint that as too involved in too many places. Nixon's, I think, going to come at it much more from the sort of traditional Republican small government focus, but he's going to paint it as one, he's going to tie it back to the Teddy Roosevelt progressive area and a fair deal kind of mentality. And I think that's going to be his slogan is, as opposed to FDR's New Deal, he's going to go kind of old school throwback. It's not about a new deal. It's about a fair deal, whether it's new or not. And he's going to portray it as, the Kennedy Democrat administration is pulled in too many directions. They're trying to do too many things at once. What I can offer is I can offer resolution on the civil rights issue, but it's going to be kind of bringing almost a sort of social libertarian view of I'm going to raise the floor to give everybody an even playing field. And from that point,
extent, I think the argument he makes is I'm actually going to make the 14th Amendment matter.
Yeah, I'm going to keep everybody on a fair start. And then from where you can go from there is up to your hardworking American values.
We are going to remove all explicit racist policies.
Mm-hmm.
And before the law, everybody will be treated equally. And that is his aim, not bringing everybody up or down. It's when you appear before the law, when you go to register to vote, when you go to try and buy property, housing.
Yep.
You will be treated
all of that. Yeah. And I think,
that really appeals in a way to a lot of his kind of silent majority people that in our timeline, he's playing them with a very different message, but kind of a getting almost, and we talked a little bit about more some of this, getting back to almost his Quaker roots of everybody being equal before the eyes of God.
Well, and I think particularly and since you brought that up, I want to talk about who we think Nixon's running mate is before we go back to the Democrats, because something's going to happen. We got to talk about what the Democratic Party. We think Nixon in this timeline, the obvious pick is going to be somebody like Nelson Rockefeller, but we actually think Nixon is going to pick kind of a guy who's today in America not so famous for who he is, but who his son is, and that is.
Because if we're talking Kennedys, we have to talk American monarchy.
Yeah, exactly. So we might as well throw all the names in here. Although we're not talking about Prescott Bush before anybody gets excited, or Herbert Walker. We're talking about George Romney, who is the father of Mitt Romney of recent presidential political ambition. George Romney.
Okay, you're gonna hate me. You're gonna hate me. That was 14 years ago.
I know.
Really recent?
Relatively. I mean, he was a senator up until like 4 years ago. So, he's at least around. But Mitt Romney's father, George, is a big mover and shaker in Republican circles during this time period. And so adding George Romney to the list.
Michigan, I believe, at this point.
Yeah. And that helps counter the sort of Hubert Humphrey-esque kind of northern progressive side, because does anybody remember where arguably the most progressive liberal wings of the Republican Party came out of in the 20s and 30s?
Go back and listen to our progressive permutation episode and you'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. I'm surprised we didn't find a La Follette to be vice president, but that's the area that Romney is coming from. So he's going to add to that kind of northern progressivist thing and also kind of help balance the ticket because Nixon's from California, and kind of compete against the sort of Humphrey-esque part of the Democratic Party. So I think that represents a really interesting change in the Republican ticket that the Democrats have to go up against. Now, as to which Democrat is...
The other thing I do want to say, I think it taps into an interesting aspect of Goldwaterism.
Yeah.
Of individualism, of making it on your own from a fair perspective, facing fair challenges.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that it does is it's the same tactic that Nixon used in our timeline with the Southern strategy of uniting conservative religious Southern voters. But instead of Nixon bringing them into his camp, he's using it as an X-Acto knife, a scalpel, to cut the Democratic Party, because he doesn't care about winning them. He cares about making sure that the Democrats can't unify them, because those Southern Dixiecrats are going to be mad at both Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. So Nixon essentially is pulling a Lincoln where he says, I don't have to win everybody. I just have to make sure that the other side doesn't. So what you're going to see is, I think George Wallace is going to have kind of a stronger showing, or whoever the sort of more racist, segregationist Democrat wildcard is from the South is going to have kind of a stronger showing vis-a-vis Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. But another big thing is, what else happens in 1968, Chris? Or no, is it 67? Is it before 67?
Well, you're saying 67. Yeah, it was literally a year later.
Okay.
You're saying early June 67 happens the same way. He's talking about the 6-Day War, by the way.
Yeah.
Happens the exact same way without actually there's despite the way it is perceived nowadays, the United States has very little involvement actually in the 6-Day War.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we change that. I think, by the way, that does change later on, going into 73. We're not there yet.
But the fact that the 6-Day War doesn't change in this timeline means a very important other thing doesn't change, and that is Sirhan going to California and using a gun against a certain somebody.
Who is, again, the representative of, in this case, the established presidential party. So Bobby Kennedy is still assassinated in our timeline here.
Yeah. So only one Kennedy down, but still a Kennedy down.
I threatened to quit the podcast if we didn't get rid of one of them.
Well, and it's too early for it to have been a Chappaquiddick situation for Chris to exit. Sorry, that was too bad. That was forced.
Part 4.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
I kind of want to like turn into Mowgli from like Last of the Mohican, wipe your seat. It's just me.
Yeah. But yeah, Bobby Kennedy still is assassinated, and the result is that whoever the administration picks, whether it's Fulbright as a replacement or somebody else from the administration going up against Humphrey at the 68 Democratic Convention, it still turns into a raucous, wild time, but instead of it being kind of an anti-war thing, it is a civil rights demonstration focused thing. One interesting thing that I think that does is, I think that may mean that Martin Luther King is not assassinated, because he may be more focused less on individual strikes, like what brought him to Memphis in April of 68. And he may be more focused on playing the long national political game. So basically, he may be saving his energies for the convention.
He hasn't achieved the legal equality which he had in our time, which led him to push for the economic equality, I guess.
Correct. Yeah. And it's also, without a Johnson in the White House pushing the Great Society stuff, the focus isn't quite on the economic side of it yet. So I think, as a kind of natural consequence, I think while King doesn't show up in Memphis in April of 68 for the sanitation worker strike and is, as a result, assassinated, I do think he shows up at the 68 Democratic Convention and starts really pushing.
I think he might be another. Okay, this is going to be a deep cut. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yep, that's exactly where I was going. Yep. And I think he ends up becoming a big supporter of Humphrey because of this situation. I think he is essentially shut out from meaningful participation in the convention itself, and so pushes for Humphrey from the outside surrounding the convention.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as a result of that, at the end of the day, what happens is, a Bobby Kennedy being assassinated doesn't have the same kind of tug on the heartstrings effect that JFK's assassination did. It was terrible. It was terrible in our timeline. It's going to be terrible in this timeline. But in terms of the impact with Bobby Kennedy, one, not being a sitting president, two, being seen as a kind of ineffectual, sort of nepotistic establishment pick.
It's the establishment thing.
Exactly. So I think the impact of the assassination, there's not going to be like a groundswell of support for the establishment in this timeline like we saw for Johnson in the aftermath of Kennedy getting assassinated in Dallas in 63. So I think Humphrey, it's not necessarily a completely clean win, but I think he comes out fairly confident with a relatively broad base of support from the convention.
I think it is a convention fight, and I think this is kind of what really helps Nixon do it again, is because you do have a divided Democratic Party fighting at the convention.
Well, and I think you're going to have, there's still going to be this sort of Dixiecrat versus Humphrey camp fight. But
I think the administration is going to put forward somebody to try and take those votes. And it's just going to be a nightmare at the convention, and it's going to make the Democrats look horrible.
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day, that is what's going to happen. And I think, especially because there's also going to be a certain subsect of society who is not pleased, like we talked about last episode, with all the diplomacy of the JFK Fulbright administration. Those are very nuanced, subtle victories. not a whole lot you can say, hey, to the average person working a blue collar job who doesn't pay attention to politics and diplomacy all the time, not a lot you can point to as a super easy, rah, 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 look at what we did, vote for us again, victory. So I think that gives Nixon, like in our timeline, but for very different reasons and with very different tools, a good way to win the White House in 68. So I think after 2 years of a Kennedy presidency, you end up just like in our timeline, or 2 terms, not 2 years. You see Nixon coming into the White House in 68, like we did in our timeline, but it's a very different platform that Nixon ran on. It's not my super secret magic plan to get out of the war that nobody knows about, that I can't tell anybody because it's all in my head because I'm a super genius. It's civil rights.
While at the same time, probably committing felonies.
I would say, since it's Nixon, statistical certainty, they're just different felonies. Well, some different felonies, some of them very much going to be the same. But I think, and just to give kind of a short, because I want to somehow finally try and keep us under an hour. I think, not to really breeze through the first Nixon administration, I think it's going to be very kind of, home front focused. I think this is actually going to be more of the Nixon that you see if you take Vietnam out of the picture. It's going to be a Nixon focused on things like a Voting Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act, maybe a Fair Housing Act, focused on not necessarily housing subsidy, but housing anti-discrimination, things like that. The EPA, OSHA, some things like that. I think that's going to be, almost ironically enough, kind of like a more successful Great Society type Nixon, as opposed to a sort of failed Great Society Johnson.
Well, just to kind of end on this note, which I think everybody knew was coming. The economic theory of the first. No, this is actually a thing.
Yeah.
Because the United States tried to have basically guns and butter at the same time under Johnson. Johnson, in our timeline, really wants to get out of Vietnam. One, so he doesn't have to pay attention to it. Two, so he can take all of the money that we're spending there and put it into giving Americans health care, giving Americans food stamps, giving them, help economically uplifting poorer Americans. And what he did when he handed off the economy to Nixon, if you look at like the early 70s, you had stagflation, you had the U.S. going off the gold standard, you had all these things happening because of the fiscal effects of the Vietnam War. You don't have that here.
Yeah. So I think that just that backdrop alone makes for a really interesting, different 1970s. But I don't want to get us too off down the rabbit hole. So I think, we always like kind of clean, just after elections, resolutions with American politics if we can find them. So I think that's where we're going to call it for today. Chris, do you have any other final tidbits or thoughts you want to get thrown in here?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay. I don't as of right now, but that's because I think if we do a part 4, we may get much more interesting in terms of stuff that's going to start happening. So I'm going to save, if we do a part 4, whatever interesting stuff we have for that. So for now, I'm trying not to react to whatever Chris is doing on the camera that y'all can't see. For now, I will simply say we're going to sign off with our final traditional ending to a Fork in Time episode. And that is, Chris, if you should come across a fork in time, what should you do?
Take it off the gold standard.
Yes. There we go. I knew something was going to happen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for us. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. If you like the episode, have any suggestions or things you want us to cover, things you think that we took a different way than you were expecting, let us know in the Discord. Otherwise, see you next week.
www.aforkintime.podcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.